Okay, this is the final video for the R093 revision for the Creative iMedia test. And this particular video is on topic 4, different distribution considerations, and the first section is all about platforms and how they reach particular audiences. So when we talk about different platforms and methods of distribution, we're basically saying how is the media product going to get to the audience? It's as simple as that. There's loads of different ways to consider. The first ones we're going to focus on are online media. Online media is usually focused at a younger audience because they tend to be more younger audiences online, as obvious as that is. Older audience, grandparents, whatever, tend not to be as IT literate. That's not to say that all of them can't use the internet, but it's saying that the majority of them are more likely to prefer other physical medium like newspapers, TV, whatever. So online medium and online platforms for distribution include things like apps. So it's a bit of software really that you download and you can play, say things like games or an app linked on a tablet. So best example being Instagram and social media, things like that. They're an app, so you download the Instagram app. That means you don't need to log into the website every time, you just go through the app. You can have multimedia devices and things, so they are what you think they are. So things you can do text, you can use images, you can use audio, you can use video on their multimedia products. So WhatsApp is a multimedia product because you can send pictures, video, audio and text, so it's multimedia. Any platform based on the web is what we call a web product, so a website, anything you can access through your mobile internet or a home network or through just a web browser. So anything usually that starts with www is a website or something that we call a web-based platform. And then finally, streaming and on-demand services. They are any media platform, TV, podcast, film, whatever, where you can essentially pause and rewind or whatever, fast forward. Essentially you stream. So it comes via the internet and you choose what you want to watch and it's at any point. Now it differs from standard TV, which is based on a schedule. So for instance, I don't know, Coronation Street's on at 7 o'clock on ITV. That's a scheduled time, that's why TV is scheduled. Whereas on demand, you go on ITVX and you can watch that episode of Coronation Street whenever you want. You can watch it 3 in the afternoon or 4 in the morning, whatever you want. That's streaming and on-demand service. Well, we talk about physical devices. Obviously, it's something you can touch. So a computer, like a computer game, you can physically touch them. The discs used to be old-fashioned discs. Honestly, it was a thing. All your games were stored on those, and that's how you did it. So for a computer, you can have interactive TVs, which are touchscreen TVs, essentially. Kiosk, which is like a touchscreen TV, but it's usually built into a box. So a bit like a cash machine almost. But if you go to a place, you'll tend to see a kiosk, which is something you can touch, and then it might be a guide at a museum, say, and you can guide your way around a museum on a kiosk, which is essentially a touchscreen TV that you can find your way around. And then finally, mobile devices like phones and tablets, and you use those to access media, whether that be on-demand service or whatever, but you use your phone and your tablet, and that's why we call those physical devices to access media. This is the way that media is physical again, but it's the way the media is distributed and transmitted to the audience. So for example, CD, DVD, Blu-ray, which are discs, the data is physically stored onto a disc, and so that's how the audience get the media product, is through this CD, DVD, Blu-ray. Like a game, it's on Blu-ray nowadays, or for you guys it's digital. Problem with those is that if they get sort of scratched, or if those get dirty, you won't necessarily be able to read them or use them in your machine, so they can become useless very quickly and easily. But the good thing is they're really cheap and they're really easy to send because they're really thin and dead lightweight. Another one is a memory stick like a USB. You can send things on those, so you can store lots of data, potentially more than a CD, DVD or a Blu-ray. The only problem is they usually cost more. And then finally, paper-based methods of physical distribution. So you're looking at transmitting paper, so things like billboards, posters, and of course newspapers and magazines. They're physical, paper-based distribution methods, and that's how media gets from the printer to the audience. This section is all about properties and different formats for media files. And specifically, we're going to talk about file compression in this next section. The first two types of compression that we're going to talk about. Compression is anything that makes a file size smaller. So the idea is we're trying to make a file size smaller to make it easier to save and then distribute. So if we can make the file size smaller, we can send it over the internet quicker because the file size will be less, so the data can be transferred faster. The downside is if we're removing some data, we're usually making the quality of the audio a bit worse, or sorry, the media a bit worse, not necessarily audio. There's two main types of compression that we need to concentrate on. There is a third really, which is raw. Raw files are essentially just as they were originally recorded, but the two types of compression are lossy compression and lossless compression. Lossless is essentially where very little data is removed, so the file size remains large, but the quality is high quality therefore. They're really good for broadcasting or publishing because the quality is so good, they look really good. The downside is that you can't really send them over the internet as easily because they use up more space, so they transmit slower, and also they will use more disk space on your hard drive. The other type of compression is lossy compression. Lossy compression is where the data is reduced, so the file size is smaller. That means they use less space on your hard drive and they'll transfer over the internet quicker, which is good. The downside is that they're not as high quality, so therefore the overall published version will not look quite as good. This next section is all about properties and formats of media files, specifically focusing on the image files first. There's some key notes here, and that is that there is two key types of image file. The first is a vector file, which is made up of lines and curves, so it doesn't really pixelate, the downside being that it will probably look like a cartoon picture because it's made up of lines and shapes. The other type is called a bitmap or a raster image, and that's made up of pixels, which are small solid coloured squares. So lots of squares of solid colour are put together, and then when you sort of come really far away from it, it just looks like an overall picture. The downside to those are that they're a bigger file size, and they will eventually pixelate because eventually you'll be able to see those pixels. The upside is though that they look realistic, but that's just a bit of understanding. What we're going to talk most about are bitmap images, just to give you a clue. The first thing you're going to focus on is resolution, and that is the number of pixels in a particular place. So the resolution is measured in pixels per inch, or ppi, sometimes called dots per inch, but it's the same thing if you see dots per inch. The higher the resolution, so the more pixels in an inch, the higher the quality of the image. But if I'm saving every single pixel's data, the more pixel data I have to save, the bigger the file size. So if you're transferring over the internet, you usually use a lower PPI and a lower resolution, but if you're printing, we usually need a higher resolution. The other one is the pixel dimensions, and that is literally just the size of the image, how many pixels are on the screen. So we measure it in pixels, and we usually talk about it width by height. So you'll say 1280 by 1080, something like that. And that's talking about how many pixels wide, 1280, and how many pixels high, 1080. That means there's 1280 pixels along the width of the screen and 1080 pixels up the height of the screen, and that's what we mean the pixel dimensions of an image, video, whatever else it is, animation, anything that you can see that is made up of pixels. Talked briefly about this before, but if we're talking about image files, the main two types are bitmap and raster images, which are made up of pixels, like we talked about. They looked realistic, which is a big strength. However, the downside is that they usually are a larger file. They are probably the most common file type that you're going to see. So most images, because they look realistic, will tend to be bitmap images. Most common file types include PNG, JPEG, TIFF, and GIF. The other type is called a vector image. Made up of lines, curves and shapes. They will never lose resolution. You could put them the size of a bus, it wouldn't make any difference. They'd look exactly the same, because if a circle is enlarged, it's still a circle. Downside really is that the file formats are a lot rarer, so you'll tend to need special software to open them, like Photoshop, Illustrator, and they tend not to look as realistic. So file formats include SVG, EPS and CDR. Right, different file formats have different strengths and weaknesses. So, for example, a JPEG, it's a bitmap file and it's a lossy file format, so the quality is going to be reducible. You can adapt it for what you need, which makes it really good for the internet, but not so good for printing. It's also a very common file format, so it pretty much open on everything. A TIFF is also a bitmap file. It's a lossless bitmap file. That means it's got high quality. So it prints really well, but it's a really big file size, so it's not great for the internet. PNGs are also bitmap and they're lossless. They're not quite as high quality as a TIFF, but they're still quite high quality. Best thing about a PNG is that you can have a transparent background, so everything else will add a white background around your image, but a PNG you can have it transparent. So if you've got a logo, it means you can have just the logo on the screen and then the normal background of whatever you want, whereas with all the others it'll add a white box around that logo. An SVG is a vector file. It means that it's a really small file size and it never loses quality, which is great. It means it prints brilliantly. The big downside is that it won't open on every device, which makes it not that useful. And the EPS is much the same. Vector and lossless, so really high quality, will never lose resolution, but it also won't look realistic because it's a vector and it's made of colours and blocks of shape rather than pixels, so it will tend to look cartoony. Right, we're on to the next section now of properties and file formats, with the next section all focusing on audio files for this part. There's a range of info that you need to consider when you're making or saving an audio file, and they sound fancier than they are, but the first one is a sample rate. Now, when you're recording an audio file, essentially what you're recording is the amplitude, which is the maximum kind of number of vibrations, I suppose is the way you word it, because it's a sound wave, so the number of wave vibrations, and the maximum height of those waves, that's the amplitude. You just recording that lots and lots, and the more you record that, the more accurate your sound will be to the original sound itself you're recording. So if I take lots and lots and lots of recordings per second of, say, music, if I'm recording a song, the more recordings I make, the more accurate my digitalized version will be. So the way I do digital audio is I use lots of what we call samples, which are these recordings of the amplitude, and I do lots of them per second, and then that tracks the movements of the sound wave. And so the more of those recordings I make, the more accurate to the original sound wave it'll be. So if I increase the sample rate, that's going to make the recording, the digital recording, sound more like the original sound itself. The downside is, though, the more recordings I make, the more data I have. So it will increase the file size, meaning it uses more space on my disk, and also it will transfer over the internet slower. But it will sound better, so that's kind of the trade-off. More often than not, standard CD quality songs and audio are recorded at what we call 44.1 kilohertz. A hertz is just a measurement of a wave. Kilo is 1,000. So essentially, for every second, we do 44,100 individual recordings of amplitude of that original sound, and we digitalize it by making 44,100 data recordings of the amplitude so that we can reenact that sound really closely to the original. If I increase the sample rate, it will sound even better and even more realistic, but the downside is more data. The other one is, so we talked about the amplitude, it's the amount of values, so the number of numbers essentially that we can use to record the amplitude. The more bit depth we have, the higher the bit depth, the more data we're given to say, well, this particular amplitude can be this number or this number. If I use 8-bit, essentially I can have any one of 200 and I think it's like 256 different figures for that amplitude's data, whereas if I record at 16-bit depth it means I can have 65,536 different values. So obviously I can have more data linked to that amplitude. So essentially 16-bit depth, long and short of it, will be a higher quality file because it'll sound even more like the original than an 8-bit depth recording. The downside is exactly what you think it's going to be. So if I record at 8-bit, that's half the amount of data per sample. So bear in mind I'm doing 44,000 in a second if I'm recording for a CD. It's half the data per sample. So I will dramatically reduce my overall file size if I use 8-bit. But if I use 16-bit, it'll be a way bigger file. But the upside is that it'll sound a lot better quality and much more like the original. I can go all the way up to 32-bit recordings as well. So if I'm doing a really fancy recording that's going to be really high quality, I could use 32-bit. The downside being it's going to be a huge file and it's going to take ages to transfer over the internet. There's a couple of different properties and formats that you maybe need to consider for audio. The first is an MP3. They're a lossy audio file, so again the quality is reduced, but that means that they're really good at transferring over the internet. So most of the things that you download over the internet, the music, will be an MP3 because their lossy file formats means that they can be transferred quicker because the file size is smaller, but that does mean that they're not as accurate to the original sound because they have some quality and some data reduced, whereas a WAV is a lossless file format. That means that quality is not reduced, so they retain that really high quality, but the downside, they're a really big file size, so they won't be used streamable on the internet as easily because the data will be much harder to transfer because there'll be more of it, so they'll use more disk space. So MP3, good for the internet, not as high quality. WAVs, lossless file format, means the high quality, they are great, sound really good, but they're not as good for the internet because the file size is bigger. Okay, the next section of the property and file formats focuses on moving image files, so video, essentially, video and TV and animation, so moving image file formats. Right, a couple of things to consider when we talk about moving image. The first one is what we call the frame rate. Now, a video or an image, moving image, sorry, is just a series of pictures put together and shown and flashed in front of your eye at really quick time, and that's animation or video. And we measure the number of pictures that flash in front of your eye. We call those pictures frames, and we measure that in frames per second. So normal TV and film and animation is shot at 24 frames a second. That means that essentially 24 pictures are going to flash in front of your eye for every second of film. Now your eye can't really see the gaps between those pictures, and what that means is that you think things are moving because your eye sees that as moving image rather than 24 static pictures because they move so quickly. Nowadays we even shoot in 60 or 80 frames a second. As obvious as this is, the higher the frame rate, the more pictures essentially you're saving per second. So if I'm saving a film and I shoot at 24 frames a second, or I shoot a film at 60 frames per second, there's more than double the number of pictures on the 60 frames per second for every second of film. So if I've got a 90-minute film, you can imagine how many more frames that is on the whole thing. So frame rate is really important. Higher quality, higher frame rate, but then more data means bigger file size. So frame rate affects the way your animation and video will look. If I have it too small, so if I do like 5 or 10 frames a second, it will look jumpy because your eyes will see the gap in between where the picture is basically staying on for a little bit longer than is normal. So if you use 5 or 10 frames per second frame rate, it's going to look a bit jumpy and unprofessional. The other thing to consider is the resolution. That is essentially the size of the image in the screen. It's measured in pixels. So if I've got a really high resolution image, basically that the size of the picture is really large. There's a range of different resolutions we use that are standard in film and TV. The first one is standard definition, and that's usually about 640 pixels across the bottom or wide, and 480 pixels tall, and then obviously you just times those two numbers together and that'll tell you how many pixels are in the whole image. High definition is 1280 pixels wide and 720 pixels tall. Full HD, or proper HD, is 1920, so 1920 pixels wide and 1080 pixels tall. We then go up to 4K, which is 3840 by 2160, and finally 8K, which is 7680 by 4320 pixels. Now, as obvious as this is, the more pixels you have, every single one of those pixels need to have a color associated with them, and then that color saved. So the more pixels we have to save, the bigger our file size. Now we do that for every single frame for every second of film. So if I'm doing 60 frames per second at 8K, that is a massive amount of data compared to, say, 24 frames a second at standard definition. So the resolution has a huge impact on the overall quality of the film or animation, because it's essentially how many pixels are saved for every single frame of the shot on the screen. Okay, so this next section and the last section in all of the video is all about different video and animation file formats that you might use. So in video and animation we have a WMV, an AVI and MP4. They're all video file formats predominantly, but you can use them through either, so you can use video file formats for animation. They all carry audio, so they have video and audio within them. The first one, WMV, is a Windows Media video file. It's a lossless file format, but the file size is usually larger because it's a lossless file format, but the quality is usually there. It's also made for Windows devices, Windows Media Video obviously, so therefore it's usually not universal, so it doesn't necessarily open on every media product opener type thing, like a Windows Gallery or whatever it's called. It'll open on that, but not necessarily on the Mac version. The next one is an AVI. Now this is a proper universal file, so it pretty much should open on anything. It's also a lossless file format because it's a really high quality file, so no data has been removed. The downside being that it won't transfer very well because the file size is huge. It'll also use a lot of space on your disk. So your hard disk, it'll use up a lot of that space because it's a high quality file format, but it'll broadcast really well. It'll look great because the quality's not been reduced at all, well, barely, but not very good for transferring. Whereas an MP4 is a proper universal file format. It will literally open on anything. Every browser and device uses MP4 files, so it's really good. It's also a lossy file format, and you can adapt the quality, so I can have a high or a low quality version, which makes it great for saving file space and really good for the internet and transferring across the internet, but a really bad choice for broadcasting because it usually doesn't retain that quality because some of the data has been removed. In animation we have a few different file types. We have an SWF, which is great because it's made for Flash, an animation file specifically, so it will allow what we call interactivity. In other words, you can have buttons, so you can have like click this and the animation will do something different, which is really, really good. The downside is that because it's not a common file format, you'll need special software to open it. So you'll need Adobe Animate or Flash or something like that to open an SWF file. And finally, an animated GIF, which is really, really common. GIFs are the original image file format, so they're really popular. Pretty much every browser, so if you're on Twitter or Facebook or anything, an animated GIF pops up, you'll be able to open it because they all know that file format, which is great. They'll open on whatever you want. The downside is they're really simplistic, so they are just a series of pictures saved together, which basically means you open in 24 individual pictures, so they're not particularly small file sizes. And also they don't include sound because they are literally just GIFs, so there's no sound with an animated GIF. So you'll see that when you open them, there'll never be any sound for that reason, because they are just sequenced pictures. It's essentially you're opening 24 pictures a second with an animated GIF, and they just, your computer scans through it quickly. So they're not very good for sound, but they are quite popular on the internet and things because they are really common in terms of every device knows what a GIF is, so it'll open it, no problem at all.